Let's create some wood materials now. Before we actually start, we need to understand one thing, and that is when you're creating a wooden material, what you generally want to do is you want to get what sort of a wood you're trying to recreate. Namely, if you take a look at wooden planks closer, what you're going to notice is depending on what type of a wood it is, the grain will not be that different, but the coloring will be. For example, if we go over to Google and we just type in a couple of different types of woods, for example, teak wood, and we take a look at all the woods here, or all the planks, we can see that they are very similar with the grain, but they have a different color, which is normal. This is what we expect from wood. We go over to oak. Again, you can see that we have those same grains, but different colors. Cherry wood, well, cherry wood is a bit more reddish, but again, the grain of the wood is the same. The only thing changing from one to the other is the hue. So that's going to play a big role when you're creating your wood, because once you actually have a base for it, or created a base for it, then we can just play around with the hue by mixing up with the diffuse color. So knowing that, let's go ahead and create a seamless texture to start with. So I'm going to open up Photoshop, and I've already went ahead and downloaded a few images of just woods, and as you can see over here, they are high resolution images. That's a must, especially if you want to have a proper texture. And another thing that we can notice, especially when we're building a texture, is that this is not just one plank. Namely, if you take a look closer, you can actually see where these planks have been put together to make it into a wide plank, which is what they do in real life. So that cannot be skipped. Especially if you take a look at here, you can almost see where all of these planks have been put together. So once you have an image like this, we can choose where we want to start with and make that thing into a seamless texture. So I actually think I like this one. It has some imperfections to it, so it might actually make it a interesting wood to start with. So let's go ahead and pull this texture into our Photoshop and start working from here. I'll start by creating a new file or a new image, and I can choose what size I want it to be. In this case, I can go with a 2K texture or 4K, but even a 2K texture will do well enough for resolution. So 2048 by 2048, okay. Right away, I'm gonna drag the whole texture over to here. So let's see how big this thing is. All right. Hold down Shift, just scale it outwards a bit. And like I previously said, when you're creating wood textures, what you want to do is simply hold down Alt, click, and drag downwards. So this way we can just copy another version of that texture underneath, and we move it upwards. There we go. Now we have this whole thing filled up. With this new selection, what we can do if we want to is we can right click and flip horizontal, and that's going to break up that, and we can also flip it vertical if you want. There we go. So that's going to break up that repetitiveness, but it kind of might be a bit of a problem here. So just so we don't have this being the same thing with this, what I'm going to do is, again, just click one more time on the vertical, and I'm going to leave it like that. All right, now I'm going to merge these two down, so Control E will merge both of them down. Make this selection on the whole thing. Control J will create you a new layer. Select the two underlying layers and delete those. So we only want to retain this layer. Now, in order to make this thing seamless, I need to go ahead and offset this by 1024 by 1024. And in the middle, I don't really see that as a viable seam. Not something that's going to be a problem because it's supposed to look like that, but I have to fix this issue at the moment. So just use the clone stamp and try to get it to a point where it's actually not visible like that. There we go. It shouldn't be that hard. There we go. Just see where, if you can see or notice this line being visible, just go over it and try to clone it around. There we go. The only thing I think that's left here is maybe something like this. All right. And there we go. We no longer see that line in the middle, nothing in, on this side. So we can just offset one more time. And there we go. So this texture, we can save it down as the bare diffuse texture. So save it. Save it as a JPEG and call this thing wood. Well, what is this? This is oak. Wood oak diffuse. Save. All right. I'm gonna go ahead and make this thing desaturated. So Control Shift and U will desaturate it. I'm gonna go save this thing as wood oak desaturated. Right, save it. I'm also gonna go ahead and add a levels to it and crunch the levels closer like this and put it to something like this, so we can have some difference between the blacks and the whites. We can call this thing either a specularity map, or we can use this thing as a bump map, whatever works for us. So wood oak specular. All right. And I'm gonna go back 2 times and just create a normal map out of this. We can use the filter. So NVIDIA, normal map, create this one. This is gonna give us a texture and we can save this thing and then go ahead, go back to 3ds Max and put everything together. All right, so inside 3ds Max, we're gonna start the IPR. And here, let me just name this thing wood oak. Now, let's see what we have created. So far, what we have is the diffuse color of the map. We have the normal map. We have the specular, and we have the desaturated version of this. Well, the specular could be also the bump. Now, knowing that, let's start slowly plugging in those textures. We're gonna go over in the map, and first of all, let's go into diffuse and just go in and drop the diffuse map. Right away, we can see it in here. I want to go in my diffuse map, check the tiling, and see if this is more suitable to something like this. So 5 by 5, maybe a little bit less. So let's try 3 by 3. Maybe 3 by 5. All right, I think this kind of looks okay. So we're going to be using a tiling of 3 by 5 for this material. All right, going to go back. Then we're going to go in down to the bump slot. Since we created a normal map, what we're going to be using here is going to be a Vray normal map. And for that, we're going to draw the normal map into the input for the normal map. Again, 3 by 5. Go back. And now, just so I can see it better, without actually having the input of the diffuse, what I'm going to do is turn off the diffuse. So I want to just see the bumpiness coming through from the normal map. At the moment, it's very hard to see because, as you can see over here, we can kind of see something on this side, but not really that much over here. So I'm going to go and change the diffuse first of all. Try something like this. Okay. Again, not that visible. But now we can go in here and increase the normal intensity here. Let's try something like 3. This should give me much more detail coming through from the normal map, which is okay for now. And at the same time, I'm going to go ahead and input the specular map in here. Again, 3 by 5. And now I can slowly start seeing this being broken up. Let me check to see if when I invert this thing, maybe it's going to be a different, but not really. Okay. So leave it like that. Increase the bumpiness to something higher. 60. Yeah, now I can see much more of that surface. And if I reintroduce the diffuse information, now I can see that this thing is really starting to look like it should. Basically a very rugged or rough looking wooden texture or wooden material. So by doing just this, we can use this as a material if we want to have a rough plank or an open plank. But now what happens if we want to have a lacquered finish added to this material? Now, that means we would need to add some sort of a reflective index to this thing. So if we go up here and we increase the reflection, what we're going to notice is that we are getting a reflection, but it's really not working the way that we were hoping for, because we cannot really see much of the environment reflecting off of it, even with the glossiness left at 1. The reason for this is simple. The reflection is broken up by the bump map. So if we turn off the bump, now I can see this reflection. But now, how do we get the bump to be preserved, and at the same time we want to have this sort of a reflection? Well, in order to do that, what we're going to do is go up, get the reflection to turn off the reflection, and now convert this Vray material into a Vray blend material. So keep the old material as submaterial, and great. Now what we want to do here is, in here we're going to input another Vray material. Now what this Vray material is going to do for us, it's only going to be used as a surface for detailing this wood. So basically think of this as a coat of lacquer that has been applied over the wood. So the wood is underneath or in the base of the material, and this is going to be the lacquer. Let's just name it lacquer. Lacquer. There we go. So in order to get this thing to look more like a lacquer, we're going to go ahead and increase the reflection quite a bit. There we go, like that. I'm gonna go and make the diffuse dark, very dark, something like this. And there we go. Very simple way of adding in this sort of a reflection. And if you take a look at here, we can actually notice that the wood is still retaining all of its bumpiness and all of the normal information deriving from the map that we used over here. Now, working this way will allow me to have total control over what is happening on which layer. So, for example, the lacquer. If you want to have a more diffused reflection or a more glossy reflection, all we got to do is go in here in the glossiness, reduce the glossiness, so maybe 0.7. This will give me a very, very diffused look. But for example, let's say that we want to have a more broken up or naturally broken up reflection. What we can do is we can use one of our textures that we previously created to break up something like this, or maybe even this one, maybe the grunge texture. So we can use a texture like that inside the glossiness slot. So let's do it like this. Glossiness reflect. There we go. Let's increase the tiling a bit. All right, awesome. Now this will give me a more of a used up surface or banged up surface look. And also, if we just want to increase or change the anisotropy of this reflection, we can get it to be a bit more skewed up. So if we go like 0.75, that's gonna make the highlights a bit more stretched out like this. We can also control the rotation. So let's try 45. There we go. So we get a more of a interesting or more complex look opposed to having just a normal reflection. But again, like I said, that's going to be very dependent on what you're trying to create. Now, another thing that we can add in here is, for example, I'm just going to get this to 0.9, and the amount that we mix here, let's write 30. All right, 30, there we go. So now the next thing I would like to add would be some sort of a damage. Let's say you want to have some scratches on the surface. In that case, all we got to do is on top of the lacquer, we need to add in something inside the bump map. So for that, I'm going to use another texture, maybe something like a scratch. All right, let's try, well, maybe one of these brush types. All right, let's go ahead with this brush 01 dark. You can find all of these in the folder. So there we go, brush 01 dark. Let's put it on the bump. And let's check it out. All right, at the moment it's just a bit too big for the tiling. So 5 by 5. And there we go. So now you can actually see that on the surface, this thing has been broken up. The reflection has been broken up with the texture that is using it for the glossiness, and the surface is broken up by the map coming from the bump map. So if I go ahead and just make this thing 98, I want to have a much more reflective surface. There we go. Let's try another 15. All right, now it looks a lot more like a semi-damaged lacquer finish on this surface, and I can also see the underlying grain of the wood that's underneath the lacquer, which is kind of what I was going for. And what is important to remember here is that every time you want to change something on the surface, you need to go over on the lacquer layer and change it here. If you want to change something on how the base looks, then you go over and change it over on this material. Now, another thing that I want to note is that when you apply another this lacquer material on top of this material, what is happening here is that the reflection, if I go over down to 100%, what you're going to notice again that we have a bit of a darkening of this of the ball. So if I turn off the lacquer, we're going to notice this material is much more brighter. But if I turn this thing on with the lacquer, especially if I just go ahead and get only this half, we can see that this lacquer is adding an extra layer of a darker look. Now, the way we can control this is by controlling how much we use of that blend by clicking on this color here. At the moment, it's mixing it at 50%. If I go up higher, we're going to be using less of that lacquer, more of that underlying material. So that's going to be a bit of a trade-off you want to be having, or you want to play around with. How much of this you want to retain, or how much you want to apply. If you go down higher, that lacquer is going to get to be a lot stronger and prevalent in how much this thing is mixed. So if you want to have a more realistic or more original look, go towards the black. If you want to have a more lacquerish look, just go down in the mixing of this. So I'm going to leave it for now at 50%. And I want to show you one other thing, and that is how do you control the color of this material without actually having to go and recreate a individual texture for any variation of the wood that you might need. In order to do that, we need to go back to our base material, and in here go inside the diffuse. Now here we have this bitmap plugged in, which is what we want. But since we want to change the color, we need to go ahead and click here and mix it up. So click on mix, keep the old submap or the old map as submap. All right. And in here, we want to go ahead and input a Vray color. There we go. Click OK. And now, when we go over to color, what we can do is click on it and choose what sort of a color we would like to add into this mix. So for example, if I go in something like a reddish color, what you're going to notice is that nothing is really changing in here. And the reason is, at the moment, the mix amount is at 0. So if I put this thing to like 20, that's going to take about 20% of this color, and that will mix with the original. So by just going in here now, I can control what sort of a color I would like to have on my wood, which is gonna make this thing a hell of a lot easier to match to whatever it is that you guys are trying to recreate. So if you have a more of a whitish color for your wood, you can just choose a brighter color. If you want to have a more saturated look, just go in here and choose which color you want to have. So having said all of that, I want to address just one more other thing before we call this thing finished, and that is when you're down on your basic wood material base here, so the wood oak, if we go down and we change the amount of bump that we use, you need to know that if you change this bump, this will kind of change the color as well. So for example, if I'm going to go ahead and really emphasize this to maybe like something like 200, this will make the color shift the hue a bit. So as you can see, it kind of got a bit darker. So a more bumpy underlying surface will, generally, it will mean that the color or the diffuse is going to be darker. So if I go even higher to 500, now you can see that this thing is starting to really look a bit darker, and I can even notice some highlights on the bumpiness here. So knowing all of that, now you know how to control the color, how to control the bumpiness of the original. You know that if you want to have a more reflective surface, you need to go over on the lacquer level. And in here you can control if you want to have any sort of a damage on the lacquer, as well as how much of this thing is going to be mixed up with the grunge map that we're using. So if I go in and go in 45 now, there we go. Much more broken up surface, but then again, it all kind of depends on what you're trying to recreate. If you're trying to recreate just a older wooden lacquered surface, this would be the best way to approach something like this.